My name's Don Swear. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions, and I want to welcome all of you here on behalf of the Center, on behalf of the Center staff. We had a marvelous lunch at the Center with former affiliates, people who had present affiliates, people who have been associated with the Center primarily as residents. It's always a very moving occasion because the people who come back for these events obviously come back because the Center meant a great deal to them, and so it's a very nostalgic occasion. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Center for the Study of World Religions, as you know. And the purpose of the event, which begins with our lecture by Leigh Schmidt this afternoon, but more particularly tomorrow for 3 panels beginning at 9 o'clock in the morning, and then ending with a dismantling of the Tibetan sand mandala, which is being made in the Braude room. And if you haven't been by there yet, I would strongly encourage you to do that. But the event sort of began at 11 o'clock this morning with the construction of that mandala, and will conclude with the disassembling of the mandala and then the pouring of the sand from the mandala in our little miniature waterfall in the center of our courtyard at the Center. It just seems appropriate, very appropriate to me, that the bookend events of our time together thinking about the Center, particularly about the Center's future, because that's really the way the panels are focused, not so much thinking about the past, but thinking about the Center in relationship to the next 50 years and the contribution that the Center for the Study of World Religions can make to the Divinity School and Harvard and beyond. So I hope there are programs, if you haven't picked one up, which are over here on the table. I hope you will take one and participate in as much of the events tomorrow as you can, including the dissolution of the or the taking down, as it were, the mandala and the procession across the street to the Center. This afternoon, or this evening, or this afternoon's lecture will be introduced by Professor Ann Braude. I'd like to thank Ann for her support of the Center as a member of the advisory board and in many other ways. She's a senior lecturer on American religious history and director of the very successful Women's Study Program and Religion Program at HDS. Her primary interest is in the religious history of American women. Her authored and edited books include Radical Spirits, Spiritualism and Women's Rights in 19th Century America, Sisters and Saints, Women and Religions in America, Roots of Bitterness, Documents of the Social History of American Women, and Transforming the Faith of Our Fathers, the Women Who Changed American Religion. Professor Braude also has a special interest in Native American religions, and this spring, in fact, is teaching a course, Issues in the Study of Native American Religion. So it's my pleasure to introduce Ann, to introduce Leigh Schmidt, who will be our lecturer this afternoon. Ann, please.
Well, after that introduction, I feel I should do more than introduce Leigh Schmidt, tonight's speaker, but you'll be thankful, I'm sure, that I will only do that, and very, very briefly, although I do have to take one moment to just express my pleasure in being able to contribute in this very small way to the 50th anniversary of the Center, to celebrating this event, and to express my gratitude to Don for bringing me on to all those Center committees that I have been on over many years. One of the benefits of serving there on all those committees has been having the chance to learn about the Center's history from its participants, often having the opportunity to hear firsthand about the experiments in intercultural and interreligious life and thought that have gone on there over the decades. And I think one of the great benefits to all of us of having the Center is that we have had to reimagine constantly what is a Center for the Study of World Religions, and it's been a real privilege to work with Don in that project. I also just have to take a moment to thank Don personally for the enormous humanity and personal as well as intellectual integrity that he's brought to his leadership of the center. From across the lawn, I have watched over the years as he has cherished and nurtured and challenged a generation of fellows, faculty, and staff who have come through the center's doors, and it's been a great privilege for me to be among them. So thank you. To my mind, it is a marvelous serendipity that in the center's Jubilee year, we have brought to Harvard Divinity School a scholar whose work is so germane to understanding both the center's past and its possibilities. It is with enormous pleasure that I get to introduce Leigh Schmidt today, to introduce him to this conference, and also I think to welcome him to the school. I think this is your first public presentation since becoming the Charles Warren Professor of American Religious History at Harvard Divinity School, where we lured him away from a wonderful career at Princeton and chairing the religion department there. In 6 books and dozens of essays, Leigh has taught us, among many other things, that sympathy, with all its potential traps and pitfalls, is nevertheless an essential tool in the critical study of religion. He has taught this by example after example of revelatory engagement with religiosity that for some reason, and often for many reasons, had not been taken seriously or appreciated in all its subtlety and complexity by other scholars. And Leigh has demonstrated that sympathy's opposite, animosity, or as he terms it today, suspicion, is at least as perilous an intellectual posture with which to approach the faiths, practices, and worlds that comprise the concerns of CSWR and the Divinity School. In addition to providing us with methodological models, Leigh's work has helped those committed to the study of the world's religion to reconstruct and interrogate our own history, particularly in his most recent, and I think my favorite of his books, Restless Souls, The Making of American Spirituality, where Leigh explores the ways in which multi-religious engagements, conversations, experiments, and exchanges have been constitutive of a liberal tradition in American religiosity. Restless Souls gives us access to a past that is both completely unknown and instantly recognizable to those raised in a culture of religious liberalism that does not fit neatly into any denominational framework. But whatever he is studying, Leigh is a historian's historian. A typical Schmidt essay, sometime to the momentary disappointment of his colleagues, dispatches the secondary literature in a few paragraphs and delves headlong into the primary sources, usually long neglected, obscure, or unknown sources to his colleagues. And he does all of this with honesty, passion, and yes, sympathy. Whether it is the excesses of the Cane Ridge revivals, most frequently denominated, I'm sorry, I misspoke here. Whether it is the exercises of Cane Ridge, most frequently referred to as excesses in the literature, or the intellectual strivings of religious liberals, or the extraordinary challenges of the visions, reflections, and religious scholarship of a 19th century eccentric, which you will soon get to read about in his forthcoming and probably soon to be my favorite Leigh Schmidt book, Heaven's Bride, The Unprintable Life of Ida C. Craddock, American mystic, scholar, sexologist, martyr, and madwoman. I think the best book title of all time. Tonight, but you have to wait for that, tonight Leigh will address us on sympathy, suspicion, and studying religion, historical reflections.
Well, thank you so much, Anne, for that lovely introduction, and my thanks to Rebecca Esterson as well for orchestrating this and helping me out in this process. And thanks especially to Dawn for the invitation to give this talk for this 50th anniversary. I appreciate that. And even before I came here, that's right. That's right. So this has been on my calendar for a while now. And, but yes, thank you for that. And it's great to be able to help celebrate the 50 years that the center has been a vibrant part of Harvard and larger conversations in the study of religion. Wilfred Cantwell Smith opened The Meaning and End of Religion, published in 1962, shortly before he took charge of Harvard's Center for the Study of World Religions, with a conspicuously slanted account of the scholarly enterprise of studying religion. Privileging experiential faith, Smith reproached certain scholars, unnamed, for the vanity of their empiricism and historicism, for their underlying irreverence and insensitivity. Such scholars might uncharitably be compared to flies crawling on the outside of a goldfish bowl, Smith concluded, making accurate and complete observations on the fish inside, measuring the scales meticulously, and indeed contributing much to a knowledge of the subject, but never asking themselves and never finding out how it feels to be a goldfish. Here instead, Smith argued, was a subject that demanded imaginative sympathy and appreciative understanding, even perhaps something akin to awe and experiential participation. Only careless hubris allowed scholars to think that religion was a field of study in which a would-be surveyor could draw its bounds and stride confidently across it. One must tread softly here, Smith advised, echoing a line from William Butler Yeats, for one is treading on men's dreams. Smith insisted that he wanted to hold on to the hard-won heritage of scholarship and science in the academy, alongside the precious heritage of ultimates at the heart of the world's faith. Still, when it came to the study of religion, he clearly wished to put the former in the service of the latter. Critical suspicion and secular scholarship did not measure up well against the higher ideals of sympathetic appreciation and spiritual cosmopolitanism. Smith's effort to historicize the category religion was a bellwether move. It augured a whole generation of scholarship in which the skeptical examination of the discipline's categories has been front and center. Not only the invention of religion per se, but Hinduism, Buddhism, Shinto, magic, fetishism, world religions, and so on. And yet the difference between Smith's aspiration for dismantling the category religion and the ambitions of most of the subsequent genealogists could hardly be more pronounced. Smith saw the modern Western reification of religion as a threat to the living practices of piety and faith, that is, to being warmly religious rather than being mundanely academic. The rise of the concept religion, Smith hazarded, is in some ways correlated with a decline in the practice of religion itself. He saw the modern construction of the study of religion, the fly's way of observing goldfish, as impeding scholars in the field from contributing to what was most urgently needed in the 20th century. First, helping imagine a world community in which different faiths and cultures cohered, and second, finding existential meaning amid modernity's wasteland. Latter-day genealogists, including Talal Assad, Tomoko Mazazawa, Russell McCutcheon, and Timothy Fitzgerald, have found Smith's underlying theological concerns very much part of what needs to be analyzed, another strong indication of the liberal Protestant norms that have for too long shaped the discipline. From that perspective, Smith's emphasis on faith as opposed to practice was no less a tool of liberal Protestant misrecognition than the abstracted concept of religion has been an instrument of colonial administration and secular statecraft. In effect, the latter-day genealogists have hoisted Smith on his own petard. One of Talal's Talal Assad's critiques in his judicious reading of Smith's classic was that Smith had been inattentive to the question of secularism, the Siamese twin of religion's modern conceptualization. Smith had more to say about secularism than Assad acknowledges, not least when it came to religion's reification as a species of secular differentiation and social fragmentation. Smith's wariness of secular methods and separations is not as thoroughgoing as Assad's analysis of secularism's practical knowledges and powers, but the two are often in sympathy with one another about the vices of the secular. Safe to say, the scale measuring fly on the fishbowl does not come off well in either ontology. In the one, it is swatted for missing the heart of the world's faiths, in the other, for refracting every culture through the same modern Western lens. It would be tempting to announce that in this lecture I come to the defense of the pesky fly, but that would not be quite right. Instead, I attempt to resituate the interpretive tension between sympathetic appreciation and critical suspicion with a longer historical view. Rather than moving forward from Smith's world theology to Assad's post-colonial genealogy, I offer the momentary pause of a backward glance, an occasion to look more closely at the historical production of both sympathy and suspicion in the practice of studying religion and the stakes involved in those stances. An unresolved ambivalence at the heart of the discipline's modern formation, these interpretive postures have been almost endlessly embodied, exemplified, and engaged. Hence, with more than a hint of capriciousness, I take two 19th century American figures, Thomas Wentworth Higginson and D.M. Bennett, as particularly illustrative of these competing yet mutually constitutive dispositions. Both Higginson and Bennett were amateurs, but then so were most learned inquirers in the 19th century. Both managed in the 15 years following the Civil War to make typifying entries into the yet nascent study of religion among American intellectuals. Higginson energetically promoted sympathy as the key to understanding the religions of the world. Bennett advanced free-thinking suspicion as the primary instrument for advancing a natural history of the gods and religions. Part one, the sympathy of religions. So we've got Higginson on this side. A fiery abolitionist, a renowned colonel of an African-American regiment during the Civil War, an activist for women's rights, a wide-ranging man of letters, and a graduate of HDS, class of 1847, Thomas Wentworth Higginson published his essay on the sympathy of religions in 1871. He had first focused on the subject during a 6-month sojourn in the Azores in 1855 as a part of a book on the religious aspects of the times, which he called The Return of Faith and the Decline of the Churches. Amid a respite from his abolitionist agitating, a break occasioned by his wife's health, he had used his encounter with Portuguese Catholicism to stoke his curiosity about religious variety and similarity. He also found the salubrious climate in the Azores a stimulus to his Thoreauvian side. He was able to spend so much time outdoors that it made Boston look, in contrast, he said, like a hospital for consumptives. It was the winter. It's not a day like this. Wandering about the volcanic crags, he was primed to discover religion in the depth of personal experience, moments of epiphany that he was sure were as likely to come on a mountain's height, as he said, as in a church. Once back in New England, Higginson never completed his book on the return of faith, and the project was soon shuffled aside in the face of more immediate political concerns and crises. In the years after the Civil War, Higginson returned to these religious questions for the liberal lecture circuit. In his diary, he noted that he began work on the sympathy of religions on January 24, 1870, and finished a 30-page manuscript on February 4th, just in time to present it 2 days later on February 6th at Horticultural Hall in Boston. Would that I could write so quickly. Of the event, Higginson noted simply in his diary, read my lecture, Sympathy of Religions, which seemed to please people very much. Would that I were so lucky. The occasion had indeed gone well enough for Higginson that he immediately set out to revise the discourse for publication, and it appeared early the next year in the Radical, an important literary nexus for liberal clubs and causes. The Free Religious Association, one of New England's quintessential post-Protestant alliances, soon embraced the lecture as a charter document and started circulating it in 1876 as a tract for the Times, 100 copies for $3. Its influence spread to Chicago, where it cropped up in the 1880s among liberal religionists there, Midwestern heirs of Emerson and Theodore Parker. Eventually, it was republished as a manifesto for the World's Parliament of Religions in 1893, and Higginson himself journeyed to the gathering to give his latest rendition of what was by then a well-traveled lecture, a commonplace of our liberal faith. The essay, republished in London in 1872 and translated into French in 1898, even had international reach and became a respected embodiment of the universalism and cosmopolitanism often evinced in the early science of religions. When, for example, Higginson met F. Max Muller on a trip to England, the latter was thrilled to meet the author of the Sympathy of Religions and promptly invited him to Oxford. That invitation was very much in keeping with Muller's deep attraction to these transcendentalist souls. He had already dedicated his introduction to the science of religion to Emerson in honor of the Concord sage's own recent visit to Oxford. Though Higginson often dwelled on religious topics in the Atlantic Monthly and elsewhere, he always took special pride in the Sympathy of Religions as his most learned achievement. Late in life, in annotating a copy of his 7-volume collected works for his secretary, he placed this essay among the very best things I ever wrote, the most varied and labored piece of scholarship I ever produced. Certainly his espousal of sympathy had a long and illustrious afterlife, not only as an expression of a universalistic piety, but also as a scholarly aspiration. Not that Higginson had taken out a patent on sympathy. His appeal to this affection set his essay within long-flowing currents in moral philosophy from Francis Hutcheson, David Hume, and Adam Smith forward. As theorized in 18th and early 19th century discussions of the moral sentiments, sympathy was especially an ethic of fellow-feeling with those in pain or distress. It was the innate human capacity for compassion. Empathy, it is worth noting, I think, was an early 20th century coinage, initially for imaginative identification with an object of art. So in the 18th and 19th centuries, sympathy was the term for heart-identifying engagement with the suffering, weak, or sorrowful. It shared no contrastive relation to empathy. As a social virtue, cultivating sympathy was seen as a way of bridging differences and recognizing common purposes. It was a basis for overcoming isolation through affective connection, of joining people in shared enterprises. Social bonds were formed and sustained through a solidarity of sympathetic emotion, a universal human sentiment more essential to the benign functioning of civic, commercial, and religious life than the particularities of any special revelation. Sympathy, in short, was a richly complex social and moral sentiment, laden with consequence for imagining relational affinities and interconnections. Largely shorn of its prior occult associations with magical healing and astrological correspondence, sympathy had come to conjure instead the mysteries of social attachments and affections. Higginson turned to that sort of moral theorizing as a practical paradigm for dealing with the rapidly growing knowledge of the religions of the world. His hope was to mold sympathy into a vehicle for transforming Christian uniqueness into religious openness. When we fully comprehend the sympathy of religions, he concluded, we shall deal with other faiths on equal terms. He sought through sympathy to release Americans into a global field of spiritual appreciation, cosmopolitan rapport, and harmonious fellowship. However it lined up with Protestant moral sentiments, sympathy was, in Higginson's enlightened theorizing, intended as a post-Christian virtue. He opened his lecture on the sympathy of religions at sea, imagining passage from one island to another, perhaps a literary residue of his excursion 15 years earlier to the Azores. The human soul, like any other noble vessel, was not built, Higginson effused, to be anchored, but to sail. The global web of commercial shipping, which so much facilitated the accumulation of knowledge that made Higginson's religious collations possible, was also present from the opening lines. It would be a tragedy, he said, to see the shipping of the world whitening the seas no more and idly riding at anchor in Atlantic ports. But it would be more tragic to see a world of souls fascinated into a fatal repose and renouncing their destiny of motion. It was an instructive image in which the market's unceasing transport of cargo paralleled the movement of religions from stranded hulks into the flux of endless exchange. And all that sparkling motion of ships and souls, and the twinned fluidity of religious identities and global markets, Christian devotions were, Higginson avowed, no more holy or more beautiful than one cry from a minaret, or the soft murmuring of, "Oh, the gem and the lotus, oh, the gem and the lotus." All were equally conduits of transcendental aspiration, and perhaps items for global consumption as well. Higginson's essay was overflowing with optimism. The fast-growing knowledge of the religions of the world was not threatening or disorienting, but productive of progress, freedom, and concord. There is a sympathy in religions, he wrote. Every step in knowledge brings out the sympathy between them. They all show the same aim, the same symbols, the same forms, the same weaknesses, the same aspirations. Certainly, Higginson acknowledged, there were shades of difference that emerged upon closer analysis, but those differences were easy to elide. Indeed, such nuances hardly mattered in the end, for once the inquirer was alert to all the startling points of similarity, Higginson asked rhetorically, where is the difference? Religion took on the same forms from place to place, and it was the commonality of patterns and not sectarian subdivisions that mattered. Religion was not something to put under a microscope. It required instead a sensitive ear in which all religions could be appreciated for their grander harmonies, or to invoke Cantwell Smith's terms, for the precious heritage of ultimates that rang through them. As Higginson saw it, recognizing these points of unity, these universal aspirations, would lift the human spirit above any single institution, scripture, or tradition. From all religions and sacred books, from the Vedas and the Bible, from Chinese Buddhists and African American Christians, Higginson prophesied, will be gathered hymns and prayers and maxims in which every soul may unite, the magnificent liturgy of the human race. The implications of such sympathies were manifest. The cosmopolitan inquirer was not merely invited, but enjoined to explore widely, to create a composite scripture out of selected sheaves from the vast storehouse of religious inspiration. That might mean gathering the moral gems of Jesus, or stringing together luminous passages from Emerson and Whitman, or pulling them all into the company of the Buddha. As Higginson grandly proclaimed, I do not wish to belong to a religion only, but to the religion. It must not include less than the piety of the world. The vast expansion of piety, was to Higginson spirit enlarging and spelled the ultimate undoing of religious exclusion, partiality, and rivalry. No single faith could claim a monopoly on love, truth, devotion, forgiveness, prayer, honesty, or mystical illumination. All do something to exemplify, something to dishonor them, he wrote. All show the same disparity between belief and practice, and each is safe till it tries to exclude the rest. Though Higginson still threw the occasional bone to Anglo-American Protestant civilization in its production of manners, arts, and energy, for example, that hardly made his argument more palatable to his Orthodox brethren. Christian claims to uniqueness and superiority would yield the platform to the sympathy of religions, to meeting those of other faiths on common ground. As Higginson concluded bluntly, of the exclusion at the heart of liberal inclusion, the one unpardonable sin is exclusiveness. Higginson's promotion of the sympathy of religions achieved an almost proverbial quality in New England's liberal intellectual circles. It was echoed by one inquirer after another as a basis for a world fellowship of faiths. Yet that enthrallment did not mean the construct went unchallenged among Higginson's compatriots. William Potter, a colleague in the Free Religious Association, found Higginson's view of sympathy Pollyannish. At best, a partial account, Higginson's lecture was said to require a companion picture, one of the antagonisms of religions. What makes the special religions, Potter reminded, is not so much the things in which they agree as the things in which they differ. That is, the claims which are peculiar to each religion. From this perspective, Higginson's optimism about a common groundwork of ethical and spiritual intelligence had to be matched by a frank emphasis on the conflicts that were constitutive of divergent religions. Another arch-liberal and sometimes HDS professor, Joseph Henry Allen, offered a more pointed critique along the same lines, noting the religious animosities that circled the globe. From pogroms in Eastern Europe to Muslim-Hindu bloodshed in India, Allen deemed Higginson's concept to be naive and colorless. We have not much encouragement for any signs of the sympathy of religions. Each of them, so far as we can see, while it is a living force, is far from sympathetic. Nay, it is antagonistic and aggressive. By 1897, William Wallace Finn, an HDS dean who seemed to enjoy dispelling liberalism's illusions, announced that Higginson's idea of the sympathy of religions had produced little more than a huge cloud of thin but amiable sentiment. Still, even amid their critiques, it remained difficult for Allen, Finn, Potter, and company simply to dismiss Higginson's call for sympathetic appreciation. If Higginson had constructed the sympathy of religions as too much a matter of sameness and commonality, they could hardly set aside the parallel aspiration for cosmopolitan affinities and alliances, for what Potter called a sympathy of souls. Higginson uneasily pursued two forms of unity. One chased after religious essences and the distillation of common notions. The other emphasized a sentimental ethics of fellow feeling and intersubjective communication. Sympathy so conceived sought both abstracted comparisons and cosmopolitan relationships. Even those self-critical liberals who took apart Higginson's naive universalism were reluctant to give up on his hopeful cosmopolitanism. True sympathy, Higginson affirmed, teaches true largeness of soul. It was, he insisted, the basis for sympathetic admiration between people of different faiths, cultures, and races. The fact that Higginson jumbled these two forms of sympathy together, a difference-erasing universalism and a relational cosmopolitanism, took another generation or more of learned reflection to sort out. By the second decade of the 20th century, though, liberal theorists of pluralism were effectively shifting ground to the sympathetic appreciation of differences rather than the assimilationist celebration of resemblances. Higginson's virtue of sympathy, in other words, was refigured by liberal theorists themselves as warmly responsive to diversity, not sameness. That reconstruction took time and was uneven, but that self-critical discussion of sympathy was indicative of the internal elasticity of this liberal intellectual tradition. The virtue of sympathy was reworked to recognize what one early 20th century elaborator called the mutual enhancement of diversities. The only unity of religion worth having, it was now said, was one that respected variety. Higginson's sympathy, in other words, was enriched without being abandoned. The debate about sympathy, about both universalism and cosmopolitanism that flowed from Higginson's lecture, the whole extended run of affirmations, disavowals, and rejoinders, had a formative influence on the scholarly study of religion in American culture. It is easy indeed to hear echoes of that exchange in the founding vision of the Center for the Study of World Religions, in which a sympathetic study of other religions was expressly enjoined, a fundamental unity and reality back of all religions affirmed, and a discipline in spiritual communication across the fruitful diversity of faiths avowed. Here are the contours of a distinct 19th century liberal ambition carried into the mid-20th century. Call it romantic cosmopolitanism, call it transcendentalist free religion, Call it a parliamentary mix of Unitarian, Vedantist, Baha'i, Theosophist, Whitmanite, ecumenical Protestant, and Enlightenment dreams. It was a form of liberal universalism, to be sure, but it was also a pedagogy of the moral sentiments, a cultivation of sympathy as an effective disposition. The point, in short, was not to be a disengaged fly on a fishbowl. The point was the capacity to feel like a goldfish felt. The study of religion, it was claimed, would be hollow, distorting, and unproductive, would be a hollow, distorting, and unproductive enterprise without that intuitive sympathy. Part 2, confronting the gods. We've got D.M. Bennett on the far side over here. Higginson may have published his lecture in a journal called The Radical. But then there was D.M. Bennett's The Gods and Religions of Ancient and Modern Times, issued in 2 volumes in New York in 1880 by the Liberal and Scientific Publishing House and running to 1,792 pages. A tip-off that this was not a run-of-the-mill compilation came in the frontispiece to the 2nd volume, where the author appeared in prison garb. That's that picture. Then, of course, there was the note on the title page that the book had been written in the Albany Penitentiary while Bennett was serving a 13-month sentence, ostensibly for sending an obscene pamphlet through the mails, but really, so the note claimed, for being an infidel editor and publisher. Or, as Bennett explained further in the preface, the work has been written under some disadvantages, in prison and the hospital belonging thereto, surrounded by sick and dying men of varied nationalities, colors, and crimes, sometimes 20 of us in a single room. I have not had by me many works I would gladly have consulted. My imprisonment is simply a piece of religious persecution instituted by orthodox enemies in consequence of my heterodox opinions. Not many of those who wanted to advance a natural history of religion wrote them from prison like Bennett did. But his predicament is a reminder that for those secular free thinkers who pushed for critical suspicion, there was much at stake in taking up and taking on religion, not least their own liberty. De Robigne Mortimer Bennett, one can see why it was usually shortened to DM, was praised by some as an American Voltaire or a latter-day Tom Paine. But he began his life as a Methodist Sunday school kid in a hardscrabble farming family in rural New York, 60 miles west of Albany. With his family destitute, having lost their farm and any semblance of cohesion, Bennett ended up leaving home at age 14 when the Shakers in New Lebanon offered to take him into their community. He lasted 13 years with the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing before the Shaker demand for celibacy proved too onerous. He eloped with another member of the community in 1846, but he continued long afterwards to have an almost familiar regard for these kind-hearted brethren and sisters. An apostate adrift, he settled for a time in Louisville, Kentucky, where he set himself up as a druggist and nostrum seller. It was here between 1848 and 1850 that Bennett discovered the literature of infidelity, particularly Tom Paine's Age of Reason. For the next 25 years, Bennett fit the bill more of a village atheist than a free-thought operative, struggling in one commercial venture after another in Louisville, Rochester, Cincinnati, and finally Paris, Illinois. He had squabbled about Christianity with local clergymen, but had done little more than that. The change came in 1873. After a drought ruined his latest business of seed farming, he decided to start at age 55 his own infidel journal, The Truth Seeker. The masthead for the new journal seemed literally to say it all. Devoted to science, morals, free thought, free discussion, liberalism, sexual equality, labor reform, progression, free education, and whatever tends to emancipate and elevate the human race, opposed to priestcraft, ecclesiasticism, dogmas, creeds, theology, superstition, bigotry, ignorance, monopolies, aristocracies, privileged classes, tyranny, oppression, and everything that degrades or burdens mankind mentally or physically. Bennett had belatedly found his métier. Soon moving his new publishing venture to Manhattan, Bennett created a niche for himself in the surprisingly robust world of infidels, radicals, agnostics, spiritualists, and women's rights activists of the 1870s. He also found trouble in the crisscrossing laws aimed at blasphemy and obscenity. At about the same moment that Bennett had founded the Truth Seeker, Anthony Comstock, a young evangelical crusader against all things lewd and lascivious, had incorporated the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. The Comstock soon managed to obtain federal authority as a special agent of the U.S. Post Office, gave his Vice Society unprecedented police power for an evangelical reform organization. Comstock always had a very full caseload, but he had a particular distaste for religious liberals and freethinkers, whom he viewed as smut peddlers and freelusters. That was his term, freelusters. In November 1877, Comstock and one of his deputies arrived at Bennett's office with a warrant for his arrest. In his society's blotter, Comstock noted that Bennett was guilty of publishing the most horrible and obscene blasphemies, as well as indecent tracts that purport to be scientific. The specific offense was sending obscene matter through the mail. In this instance, Bennett's acerbic open letter to Jesus Christ and a pamphlet on the sexual reproduction in marsupials. The latter was actually not an uncommon free expression gambit. You find some zoological or agricultural treatise that was safely circulating and use it to test the legal consistency of the Comstock Law. There was another notorious case in 1892 when Moses Harmon and Lois Weisberger republished an excerpt from a government booklet called Special Report on Diseases of the Horse, which had used the word penis and had recommended putting the horse's penis in a sling when it was inflamed from one disease or another. When they reprinted that passage from a federally produced pamphlet on horses, they were then, their journal was locked down, put under a temporary postal ban. Again, in any case, so that's why the sexual reproduction of marsupials, why Comstock might think that it only purported to be scientific, because there was a kind of flaunting, a testing here going on. In this instance, Bennett's lawyer got the case dismissed, but Bennett was then arrested again the following year for circulating an infamous free love tract on marriage reform and sexual self-government, Ezra Heywood's Cupid's Yokes. Earlier that year, Comstock had already imprisoned Heywood himself, the president of New England's Free Love Association, who in Cupid's Yokes had mocked the fanaticism of the vice crusader and asked the startling question, why should priests and magistrates supervise the sexual organs of citizens? This time, no lawyerly intervention helped. I mean, this was one of the worst alliances you could have, the alliance with Heywood. And Bennett's case went to trial in March 1879 with freethinkers rallying under a free speech, free press banner. The civil liberties line of argument was at this point no match for the charge of mailing an obscene, indecent book. Bennett was summarily convicted in federal court. A conviction was then sustained on appeal. His case actually had the effect of significantly strengthening Comstock's legal hand in that a British precedent on obscenity, the Hickland Standard, was now extended to American jurisprudence for the first time. A literary work was now considered obscene if any part of it was deemed to have a tendency to corrupt the minds of the innocent. Bennett was sent to the Albany Penitentiary to serve a 13-month term, the victim of what he and other free press defenders were now calling the American Inquisition. There he suffered the wretched indignities of prison life, and certainly his announced infidelity won him no friends among the institution's authorities. You know, he said to one comrade who visited him at the penitentiary, I have not been used to being treated and spoken to like a dog. It was in this setting, in these months, that he decided to write his really big book on the gods and religions of ancient and modern times. In all kinds of ways, the two volumes were a mess. A hodgepodge compilation in which Bennett regularly used long extracts to pad his work and almost randomly inserted encyclopedic tools. For example, an 18-page glossary on Norse mythology. Not in a position to have much of a library at hand, he had two kinds of sources from the emergent comparative study of religion at his disposal. The first type was from the Higginson side of the religious spectrum, the works of romantic liberals and Unitarians, including Lydia Maria Child's 3-volume Progress of Religious Ideas and James Freeman Clarke's 10 Great Religions. The second type was from the works of more secular-minded evolutionists, including freethinker Thomas Inman's Ancient Faiths and Modern, and anthropologist E.B. Tyler's Primitive Culture. It was from this second set of writers that Bennett took his orientation, boldly positioning himself in the lingering glow of the skeptical Enlightenment and the more recent gleam of biological and cultural evolutionism. Bennett began his natural history of religion with a grand picture of the advancement of geology and paleontology, sciences that he saw foreclosing any human-centered account of creation. The opening excursus set up a familiar free-thinking opposition. The real knowledge of empirical science displaced the fables and fantasies of religion. Illusion gives way to reality, Bennett remarked, and the magic picture disappears. The questions to ask about religion were not theological or exegetical, but evolutionary, social, and psychological. When and why did humans invent religion? Embracing a line of argument familiar from Hobbes and Hume, among others, Bennett attributed the primal source of religion to fear and dread, emotional vulnerabilities that were compounded by ignorance of the forces of nature and an anthropomorphizing imagination. Then, borrowing another page from Enlightenment histories of religion, the originating power of priestcraft, Bennett postulated that a special class emerged to exploit these fears and came to exercise a tyrannical control over the common people. It is in this class of self-constituted agents and advisors of the supernal powers, Bennett concluded, that have invented the countless number of creeds and religions which man has been compelled to sustain. In turn, the power of priests had for millennia impeded progress in religion. Though sparks of positive evolutionary development could be discerned, mostly humanity had awaited the advent of modern science to make any headway against superstition and priestcraft. The bulk of Bennett's first volume was devoted to the invention of the gods, ancient and modern, in their endless variety from India to Rome, from Africa to North America. The encyclopedic entries went on for hundreds of pages. An undisciplined catalog looked well on its way to consuming the first 835-page volume, until finally it became evident that all of these other gods were prologue to diminishing the Christian God. At best, the Christian faith was but a facsimile of prior mythologies. Jesus, a copy from pagan models, read one section head. At worst, Christianity seems simply to redouble mindless supernaturalism, miracles and demons, say, and oppression of women and slaves, for example. Perhaps most immediately revealing was Bennett's section on Bible obscenity, in which he made a long list of the coarse narratives of the scriptures involving adultery, rape, incest, concubinage, polygamy, and the like. All these lewd and immoral tales made him wonder why he was doing time for mailing a pamphlet on marriage relations in which there was, as he said, not 1/100th part of the indecency that the Bible contains. The bottom line for Bennett was this: the sooner man lets all the gods go to the shades of forgetfulness, the better it will be for him and for the world. The second volume did much the same for the various religious traditions that were organized around this vast pantheon of gods. Here, Bennett marched his way through the rites, temples, prayers, and scriptures of the religions of the world in both evolutionary and geographic terms, again culminating in a long and critical account of Christianity. By the end of the 957-page second volume, Bennett had set up a monument to free thought, the most sustained critical history of religion yet produced by an American. Why, when he was simply supposed to be making shoes in a prison factory, did Bennett expend so much effort cataloging the religions of Phoenicia, Chaldea, Egypt, and Assyria, not to mention Judaism, Christianity, and Islam? Why bother obsessively studying religion, the whole human propensity for the devising of gods, when one found that proclivity so childish? His compulsion was based on a view of knowledge not so much as exposure, but as emancipation. It was not a cynical project of destruction and mockery, or at least not solely that, but instead a humanistic mission of liberty, happiness, and enlightenment. The point was to set the human mind free of religious phantoms and those who manipulate them for their own gain. Bennett quoted the agnostic orator Robert Ingersoll to this effect toward the close of his work: "The doubter, the investigator, the infidel have been the saviors of liberty." Bennett undertook his project of disenchantment in that heroic, even salvific light. To write this natural history of the gods, as he called it, was to underscore the bleak history of religious violence, bloodshed, tyranny, and persecution. It was to reveal the fearful, ignorant, oppressive roots of America's own Inquisition. Religion, in short, deserved not appreciative sympathy of its transcendental flights. Religion demanded instead hard-nosed suspicion of its cunning politics. In conclusion, we've got William James here in the middle. We're going to get to James. Neither Higginson nor Bennett was a professional scholar. Neither was in danger of being labeled a narrow specialist or succumbing to William James's PhD octopus. As amateurs, neither had anything like the academic standing of that initial generation of university chairholders in the science of religions, a small handful of whom had been installed by the 1870s and 1880s in Europe and the United States. Yet the tension between sympathy and suspicion that they dramatized was very much inherited by the emergent discipline. It imbued one formulation after another of what it would mean to cultivate the study of religion in the American university, not as a wing of Protestant theological schools, but as a distinct endeavor within the arts and sciences. In the varieties of religious experience, William James, hoping his lectures might become a crumb-like contribution to the new science of religions, so-called, confronted this tension directly. On the one hand, he saw this science as having the potential to sift out a consensus of opinion and thereby offer mediation between different believers, a kind of cosmopolitan diplomacy based on an inductive understanding of the experiential core of religions. The science could conceivably, James suggested, do what Higginson hoped and Max Muller too espoused, that is, help its practitioners discern universal sympathies or ideal essences across religions. On the other hand, James reasoned that this new science might be at cross purposes with that aspiration. It could well turn out, he remarked, that the best man at this science might be the man who found it hardest to be personally devout. Was there any reason why the science of religions would not fall into line with other materialistic sciences and come to blunt the acuteness of living faith? The sciences of nature, James observed, know nothing of spiritual presences. Understanding the elementary forms of religion, the purely theoretic attitude, James called it, was fundamentally dissimilar from living religion. He speculated that the very science of religions itself was likely the product of a deeper antipathy to religion. Was it not finally committed to a view of religion as an anachronism or survival, an atavistic relapse that the enlightened have outgrown? Was it not aimed at freeing people of the groveling and horrible superstitions that the cultivator of this science faced time and again? In short, James confronted, at the close of the varieties, this troublesome question: was this new university science one of sympathy or suspicion? James highlighted these tensions in the science of religion, so-called, without resolving them. They lingered. When Princeton University called the philosopher George Thomas to start a department of religion in 1940, he gave an inaugural lecture in which the consequences of secularism and naturalism for the study of religion haunted him. To ask for an impartial, objective study of religion is legitimate and in a university essential, he acknowledged. Yet, he insisted, the rational analysis of religion, which we are undertaking, should never be allowed to become a substitute for the living experience of religion. The analysis and evaluation from the outside, from the point of view of the observer, must be supplemented by an attempt to penetrate to the heart of it by intuition and to identify oneself with it in feeling. Thomas ended his Harrington Spear Paine lecture where Wilfred Cantwell Smith began the meaning and end of religion, with an emphasis on direct insight and sympathetic fellow-feeling, trumping secularism and naturalism. Thomas had no crawling fly on a fishbowl, but he did have an image of an aloof observer scrutinizing a rock or crystal and hazarded that any scholar of religion who similarly contemplated religion from the outside with cool detachment would never achieve genuine understanding. No doubt the pendulum has swung dramatically in the last generation away from the sympathies of Higginson, James, Thomas, and Smith. No doubt the critical study of religion has come to depend more and more on cutting through such romantic sentiments rather than cultivating them. Reverence is a religious and not a scholarly virtue, Bruce Lincoln has tartly remarked. The failure to treat religion as religion, that is, the refusal to ratify its claim of transcendent nature and sacrosanct status, may be regarded as heresy and sacrilege by those who construct themselves as religious, Lincoln elaborates, but it is the starting point for those who construct themselves as historians. Perhaps then critical suspicion has finally carried the day, and rightly. Perhaps the field's romantic past has finally been relinquished, the only reverence left, the reverence for academic excellence and deep learning. Perhaps scholars of religion can now be scholars without apology, historicist, empiricist, unsympathetic, even blasphemous and obscene, letting the chips from their workshops fall where they may. And yet it would be surprising if such a fundamental ambivalence had resolved itself so neatly, that with this liberal religious genealogy pinned down, the field can now march along a critical scholarly path, cleverly exposing one truth regime and knowledge power nexus after another. After all, secular critique has now turned dramatically on itself, and the return of religion seems everywhere apparent, not least across the humanities and social sciences. Even D.M. Bennett, once out of prison, embarked on one last big project, a tour of the globe that he chronicled in a 4-volume travelogue entitled The Truth Seeker Around the World. It ran to even more than 1,700 pages. Given how he viewed primitives and their gods, his literary traipsing was not a cosmopolitan tour de force. The excursion gave him a chance to visit, as he said, the numerous god factories of other cultures firsthand. Something strange, yet strangely predictable, happened when he got to India. He fell in with Madame Blavatsky, Henry Olcott, and their community of theosophists, spiritualists, yogis, and Buddhist catechists. He was taken up short by the mysterious phenomena surrounding Olcott in particular, the inexplicable communications from the guide Kut Humi, supposedly 2,000 miles away in the Himalayas. This was not what his free-thinking subscribers back in America were paying for, or were expecting from his globetrotting. A questioning of his own materialism, a slack-jawed amazement at occult powers, a hobnobbing with suspected charlatans. I am ready to believe Hamlet was right, Bennett concluded, when he assured his friend Horatio that there was in heaven and earth many things not dreamed of in his philosophy. In 1882, with the backing of Blavatsky and Olcott, Bennett became a member of the Theosophical Society. It turned out for Bennett, as it has often turned out since then, that the field's transcendental aspirations and romantic sentiments were not so easy to dispel. There he was, the old freethinker and erstwhile shaker, bedeviled by the same sympathies that had smitten Higginson and company. Bennett, too, had come to ask, and perhaps even to intuit, how it feels to be a goldfish. Whatever else it implies, Bennett's theosophical turn suggests the intimacy of suspicion and sympathy, how quickly liberal secularism could turn into liberal religion, and vice versa. That is the twin inheritance of the scholarly study of religion, the mirrored reflections of romantic cosmopolitanism and free-thinking secularism. Not even in the early 21st century, with all our genealogical canniness, is it easy to stand outside that dual legacy or to separate these Siamese twins. Nor is it obvious that we would want to pry them apart if we could, and then proceed with one half of the pair over the other. In the charged space between distance and engagement, scholars of religion still make their way, secular, empiricist, historicist to be sure, but also well aware how limited, fragile, and particular the stance of critical suspicion has been and will be. The science of religion, so-called, was a grab bag of late 19th century methods, hopes, and perplexities. That jumble was a source not only of contamination and occlusion, but also of curiosity and insight, a crumb-like contribution to the humanistic pursuit of freedom, enlightenment, and cosmopolitanism. Sympathy, it seems only fair to conclude, can now be accorded the discipline's own historical amalgam without sacrificing suspicion. Thank you.
Do you want to just handle questions yourself?
Sure, I can do that.
Yeah,
So,
thank you very, very much for obviously very provocative lecture, and particularly when I invited you to do this before you even come here. So, at any rate, we will handle questions
sure.
Directly.
I'm happy to take questions. I'm also happy to let, is there a reception after this?
I'm very interested in James Freeman Clark and his 10 great religions.
Right.
My understanding of that is that he thought we ought to have sympathy for all of those religions. But however there is progress in religion, there's an evolutionary process. And somehow the evolutionary process of religion culminated somewhere along Warren Avenue in Boston in 1883. Do you get that sense of Clark and the attitude of some of his colleagues?
Yeah, I mean, Clark is not the post-Christian that Higginson is. And so he does put Christianity still at the center of it. It's like he has a chart of it where all of the different religions are on the outside, and Christianity is kind of the core that kind of is reflective of or culminates in. So yeah, right. So it's a different project, and then he's extremely popular. That work's much more popular than Higginson's essay in all kinds of ways. I mean, it really sells and is read widely as a project in comparative theology. But his project is not the same as Higginson's. It's not post-Christian in that way. So yeah, but he's part of that company of liberal religionists in that period who are debating this and making real contributions. So it's easy also to now make light of his contributions, or to read them in terms of our own preoccupations and not see the conversations of which he's a part of. I mean, he tends to not come off well in these genealogical accounts and the making of world religions. Tomoka Mazazawa does not think highly of him. So I tend to want to read against the grain of that. But you're absolutely right to see Clark that way.
Just like put in a word here for those of us who worked with Wilfred Cantwell Smith about his reverence for academic excellence. I don't think there's any question that he was sort of overtly on the side of academic excellence, not necessarily opposed to sympathetic study, whatever that means. But he wasn't really so interested in what it felt like to be a goldfish, but rather asking a different kind of question about the study of religion, which is, what does the world look like to people who are adherents of various religious traditions, rather than what does that system of religiousness look like? And in doing that, I have to say, he was a slave driver for academic excellence. So I'm not so sure that the sympathy suspicion thing works all that well in relation to his own work. He was complex in the sense that he did have this other theological side, but in his academic work as a scholar of Islam and the other things that he did as a scholar and demanded of his students, I think there was certainly a little bit of both of these, and certainly a lot of the insistence that academic excellence demands a kind of relationship between the scholar and the subject that is not that's not easily objectified, but that fits into the realm of, I guess, what you'd have to call the dialogical, that you have something to learn from the people you study.
Don's giving a lecture tomorrow on this, so I'll defer to his sense of that. But no, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a critical tension in that it's the same. It's the same I see in George Thomas when he's talking about the founding of the Department of Religion and Prince. Same kind of critical tension. I mean, there's a desire not to forsake in any way this commitment to academic excellence and deep learning and critical suspicion and this great heritage and hard-won heritage, as Smith says, hard-won heritage of science and scholarship, which is exactly what these freethinkers point out. This is hard-won. So that's there, but then at the same time, there's the lingering commitment to the if you want to call it a romantic project of kind of intuitive sympathy and appreciation, something that seems grounded in those moral sentiments. So he wants to hold them together. And I think in the first part of the meaning and end of religion, which is what I'm drawing from there, it's tilted, more toward the cosmopolitan claims than that. But that's not to say that he doesn't see these things as profoundly in tension, which is, also what James is highlighting and trying to highlight as well.
My colleague Diana, with respect to Dr. Smith, that it was not only theological with him, but sociological. When he said that the religious consciousness has reached a kind of climax and no more divisions or major conversions are possible, and we have to live in this globe, and therefore we have to understand each other. That is a kind of sociological imperative also there, and that's a very important point. But from the time he was speaking, and now what we see across the world in globalism and kind of development of the various communities, say in Europe, presence of Islam, and here, so there is this kind of sociological changes which are coming that makes it more imperative to recognize the diversity and how to work with that.
Dan, did you want to get into it?
Did you want to say something?
No, I mean, I agree. I don't want to. I certainly wasn't trying to come off as an out-and-out skeptic of this cosmopolitan imperative. I mean, I was actually, I'm trying to resituate it in that conversation. So I'm in full agreement with that way of thinking about this.
Yeah, I was intrigued by the long list of radical causes espoused by the truth seeker and the degree to which those causes, women's rights, anti-monopoly, paralleled Higginson's own sociopolitical commitments. So I have two questions about that. The first would be, to what extent did these two men experience themselves as allies, and to what extent as rivals? And the second question would be, to what extent do you see the liberative agenda that they shared moving forward in the study of religion as it develops in the 20th century?
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of ways in which Bennett and Higginson should be allies. I mean, Bennett is just too reckless to be, to be embraced. I mean, he tends this side of the liberal movement really fractures the cause. You get the National Liberal League, and this is a kind of free religious association side of this. But they fall apart over the obscenity, blasphemy kind of questions. And Bennett is on the radical side of that question. And that's what breaks this apart, is that the more moderate liberals, like Abbott, want to emphasize that liberals haven't gone soft on these sex trade issues that Comstock's highlighting. I mean, that's just what he really wants. This is a point, and that they think that they're just going to get beat up on this if they come out against the Comstock. And so they retreat on that point. And so the folks, the radicals like Bennett, who are constantly fighting the Comstock laws, that breaks up the alliance. So yeah, there's all kinds of shared ground, but on the whole, that's where people don't want to associate with them, and they have to, they kind of go off, they have their own groups and you know, defenders. They form their own defense societies, free speech defense societies, to defend themselves. But that's not where the Higginson side of this is going. I mean, it's like Whitman is always a test case. I mean, do you like Whitman or not? Higginson does not like Whitman at all. Bennett loves Whitman. I mean, so it's, you know, it's, you know, so you were going to defend him or you're going to ban him. So that could be a kind of a breaking point. I mean, as far as where this is going, I mean, that's you know, that's a good question. I mean, whether I mean, I'm not sure how far I would, yeah, how far down, yeah. I mean, it's hard. I mean, this is a tough question. What the debates look like. What I'm more interested in here, clearly, is trying to figure out a kind of an interpretive disposition that one brings to one's materials. So the questions, the political question of the kind of liberative stances that these people bring to it is not the question that I was thinking about, though. You know, politically, socially, you know, I'm in great sympathy with this tradition. But my primary concern is, you know, at this point is thinking about what is the scholarly stance supposed to look like? What are we doing as interpreters of this? And so I've spent more time thinking about that. And I find actually that anytime well, and I don't do this very often. I mean, you do this much more consistently and bravely than I do. If I go out on a limb on this kind of like, I actually like the liberal religionists. I mean, you don't know how quickly, you know, you get beat back on that. So, you know, and then I finally have to tell them, I finally have to say, it doesn't, and this, I just had this in a discussion recently with someone who was, you know, attacking the Higginson crowd, and I ended up being the apologist for the Higginson crowd, which I really wasn't a role I thought I needed to play, but nonetheless, that's what I ended up playing. And, you know, I finally said, it doesn't matter whether I like them or not, you know, or whether I want to, you know, continue this on politically and socially. Empirically, you know, this tradition looks like this. This is much more complicated. I mean, it was you know, reading Higginson on race in a way that I thought was terribly unsubtle. So I've spent more time trying to recover them in that kind of way, and then I'll let others figure out if there's constructive import to this, socially and politically. Bill?
I just wish you'd say, I'm terribly fascinated, particularly with the moment I walked in the room, with your placement of William James in the middle of this. But I mean, in the way that it worked out, in some ways, I mean, it strikes me that, and I guess I feel much this way about James, that James is somebody I'd rather hang my hat on than most other interpreters, modern or ancient, and that would include our latest critical minds in the field. I mean, I just wish you'd say a little bit more about your own take on sort of the Jamesian two-sidedness. I mean, I think there is a double facet to James's own, just in the varieties. You could read that two different ways, depending on what part of that you pick up.
I know, yes, but nonetheless, I mean, you're right, absolutely. I mean, I put him in the middle because of the ways in which I find him so alluring. I mean, constantly coming back to it. And it's not because I think he resolves it or he's clear about it. It's because he's so suggestive. I mean, he's so provocative. He puts the issues out there, he crystallizes them, and he doesn't make them so much clearer. I mean, I think he makes the tensions that much more obvious or something. And that's you know, I admire that because I don't think I mean, it's just like he's just completely torn about what the implications are of starting the science of religion at a university. You know, and you can't. He thinks, you know, on the one hand, I mean, he sees all of this naturalistic impulse that looks, you know, like kind of free thought traditions in all kinds of ways, not as aggressive as the Bennett. But Bennett's the kind of dramatization of the naturalism. You know, but on the other hand, you know, he's looking at all of the cyclical research material, and that, you know, that's he's so drawn into those discussions, and there is a kind of way. I mean, I think that people tend to be critical of him because he's not enough. He's too much of a sympathizer of, you know, that kind of claim. He turns the lights down low to give God a chance, or give miracles a chance, turn it down so the mystery can flourish. And so that there's just not enough of that kind of enlightenment project. And the lights are turned down. It's like a seance or something for James. And yeah, so I don't know. He's still sort of the figure I turn back to as kind of the most provocative in all kinds of ways. And he certainly is the figure I like to feel like I'm writing in a certain Jamesian tradition where I write about religion. But that's because I also tend to write about individual eccentrics, and it fits the model well. If that weren't my questions about religion, I think I would find James terribly frustrating. But I guess he likes to write about individuals in their solitude. Hotter and crazier the religion, the better. He has all kinds of possibilities for me. Right. But if you were a sociologist, you would probably, without finding quite the patron, some that I do. No.
Thank you very, very much for what you've shared and taking us back. One of the things that has come through to me in my own personal experience is the essentiality of understanding the culture of the community in which I am trying to understand their faith. Not only the present culture, but the inherited history. And if that can be looked at objectively and not simply compared to my own, I think I'm on a better track. It's your experience?
Right. An important principle of history. And that's what I think the center has done, and I like to put that in a kind of tradition of what the disciplines are in terms of the process of understanding that.
What's important is to get to the heart of religion. That's been neglected in this talk. The heart of religion is experience of mystical union. Why don't you talk about that?
I mean, this is, Higginson would say that was, a crucial part of it. I mean, this is exactly in this romantic tradition to think that is the heart of religion. This kind of peak experience, the moments of epiphany, the experiences of oneness, being a transparent eyeball. This is all, deep in that side of the tradition. Certainly, James highlights it over and over again. Comes back to mysticism and mystical experiences of oneness, and certainly sees it as a kind of the center, in essence, heart of it. I'm more interested as a historian in how it is we came to think that that's the heart of religion. Because I see that as a construction over time. Very particular notion about what the heart of religion is that came into being over the course of the 19th century and lingers with us in very strong ways. So as a historian, I'm more interested in how religion got defined as having a heart that is mystical union. And a lot less interested in that as an ontological claim. But that's a historian saying. So it would be a kind of methodological impasse that we would find ourselves in.
Do you know about mystical union?
Do I know about it? Is this going to be kind of, it takes a mystic to know mystic?
I'm trying to put this on a serious level.
Right. No, look, it's an important question about religious experience, whether one needs to have the experience in order to understand the experiences. And that's a valuable question. I I personally don't think you need to be one to understand it.
Excuse me?
I don't think you need to be one to be a good interpreter. I don't think it requires that kind of inside knowledge in order to be a good interpreter. In this way, I'm, much more on the skeptic side.
For example?
Could I interrupt that? I mean, and sort of turn your question, I think, somewhat in the direction of what Leigh was commenting on in regard to Bennett. I'm curious as to Bennett, what's the appeal of theosophy for him? Is he at all explicit about that?
Right. I mean, it is truly an inscrutable episode. I mean, it seems to come out of the blue, given everything else up to that point. And I think it shows you just the permeability of these bounds. I mean, the liberal seculars share so many assumptions with the liberal religionists that they, underneath they have certain ideals about freedom, certain ideals about the individual, and these things can, in a moment of encounter like that, switch. And there is a lot of, dramatic paranormal activity surrounding theosophy and those figures, and that changes a lot of perfectly rational people's lives. In that period, I think that he comes into contact with them and is drawn into the world. I mean, he really talks about Olcott and phenomena around Olcott. He just seems to not be able to explain it. So it's like someone encounters a powerful seance for the first time, and they suddenly, they just say, this is beyond the range of what I can explain by the philosophy I've had hitherto. And he's drawn in. So that's what it seems to be. He hasn't lived much longer, so we don't know if this would have stopped. He gets sick. So he can around the world.
Retain his
home. So you could say this was like a moment. And he would have gotten back and he would have been hanging out with his free-thinking buddies in New York again, and they all would have told him, you lost your mind temporarily when you were in India. And here are all the ways in which we can expose the theosophists. The tricksters, the charlatans. Look at Madame Blavatsky, look at her record. And they might have been able to reconvince him, but he doesn't last long enough to reconvert to unrestrained, unnuanced rationalism. So it's just this, this moment of, they have to consult the spirits because they're not sure whether they should admit him because he's such an out-and-out critic of religion. So Olcott and Blavatsky consult the other world, and they get the word that it would be good for the Theosophical Society of the United Time because he's out there, fighting the good fight for liberal causes, and he would be something of a jewel for them to have him in their society. So they get spiritual blessing for taking him in, even though his record up to this point is not exactly one we would say. Let's admit him. It's a puzzle. I mean, I think these puzzling things happen to people in these types of settings, but it really seems to come down to his experience of Olcott. And we don't have a very detailed account from him of that. We have some account, and we have some account of the process by which they decide to admit it. But it's not deeply rich in source material.
Maybe a couple more questions, Tom?
I wonder if we could take this most recent topic and develop it a little more from a slightly different angle. And the topic being mystical experience, and then the historical perspective on what was happening with the Theosophists and the various interpretations there. I wonder if you could comment on a movement within the academy, and I think religious studies is perhaps less enamored of it than virtually any other part of the academy, and that is the field of contemplative studies. that has neuroscientists, social scientists, performance artists, theater artists, very excited. And it's only beginning to make an appearance in AAR, for instance, but it is an appearance. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, this is fascinating area because you can see these tensions played out. You have neuroscience like Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin, who's very much on the side of this is, let's wire up the Buddhist monks and, learn something about the realities of this practice and the compassion that it produces. I mean, a kind of very positive approach. And then you have, Richard Dawkins and company wiring people up, and to prove, religion is entirely a natural phenomenon. They can locate the God spot and explain it all away. So it seems like a technological turn that is just brilliantly laying out this tension again. You have Daniel Dennett and Dawkins and company looking at meditation. I mean, Dawkins has had himself wired up, and of course nothing happened to him. Put some transcranial stimulator on his head and didn't have an experience of contemplative awareness. So it's fascinating that way. But you're right that it's not a term that seems to be making its way in religious studies. Where it's going on is in other disciplines. And we actually at Princeton had a big conference on religion and neuroscience, and we did have two people from religious studies commenting. I was one of them, and Wayne Proud from Columbia commented. So there was something of a conversation, but it was almost entirely outside religious studies, that conversation. And if you look at, for example, there's this group, the Center for the Contemplative Mind and Society, I think it is, right? Yeah. Fascinating. They're funding a lot of academic projects, but I get a sense that, and some people in religious studies, but that's not where the lion's share of the funding is going. I mean, it's going to musicians who want to teach meditation in relationship with the arts or things like that. So you're right that this is not an area of investigation that seems to be attracting as much interest in religious studies as in some other fields. Now, I think partly that has to do with the suspicions about the way in which religion has been finding romantic to Jamesian terms, in terms of the meditative individual and things like that. So in religious studies, there's a kind of canniness about the whole impulse that makes people skeptical, wary of going down this path and entering into these conversations. So you find other people. You find them there, people in the schools of education and things like that. So yeah, I've been to one conference and have, and so I see what's going on, seeing some of this going on, but you're absolutely right. It's not a religious studies driven exchange at all.
And one quick footnote on that. There is in the fall's AAR meeting an introductory panel on contemplative studies in religious studies and a volume coming out next year from SUNY on this topic. So that's what I meant by it's slow out of the gate, but the gate is open.
Well, yeah, I mean.
And Anne Harrington
Right.
is one of the keynote speakers at this year's AAR. She's the editor of the Dalai Lama at MIT, and she's a historian of science.
And she's been a collaborator with Richie Davidson on this stuff too. Right. So yeah, so it's percolating, and that is one of the interesting things I think for religious studies is to see. I mean, usually people in religious studies, they just don't know what to do. I mean, it's one thing I think we know what to do with Richard Davidson and company a little bit, but what we don't really know what to do with are the hard-boiled naturalists who want to, study the meditative mind or study, scan brains and, in order to discover, the religion to be a wholly natural phenomenon. That's where the conversation there doesn't seem to be very much conversation there. And I'm curious about that.
We'll be
Yes, thank you very much for a beautiful lecture. I just wanted to ask you one thing, though. In all fairness, shouldn't one disconnect the tradition of liberalism that you beautifully sketched out from the contemporary modern critical debate? Because it seemed somewhat unfair to me that you would describe the project of a Talal Assad or Tomoko Masuzawa, whether one agrees with the interpretation of Kenfield Smith or not, in the same trajectory. For one thing, when Talal Assad writes his genealogies of religion, or when Tomoko Masuzawa speaks of inventions of world religion, she's not, or he is not, suspicious of religion per se. One might even make the argument that their suspicion of a certain construction of the religious studies or theological vocabulary tends to open a wider field of possible religious experience, even beyond that which could be captured by the very concept or term of religion. So that would be one aspect of a certain hesitation that one might have inserting these names in this debate. And the second one is a more systematic or philosophical question. Could you say a bit more about how it is that one could simultaneously or in some mode of alternation inhabit these two different modes of these mental or interpretative dispositions of suspicion and sympathy? Because they are however one turns it, categorically, logically distinct. You're in or you're out. But there's a long tradition, I would say, and I wouldn't claim that Assad and Masuzawa are part of this, but there is a long tradition of studying religion where somehow one would have to multiply the suspicions in order to get to the proper sympathy. So I don't know who used this term. I think it was either Helmut Peukert or Johann Baptist Smith, but a certain advocation of atheism ad majorem Dei gloriam, or at least some sort of minimal theological kenosis, ascesis, or restriction out of a respect, as it were, of the object itself.
Right. I mean, that's an excellent point. Both points. Yeah, I think. I wanted to invoke the latter-day genealogists in that conversation just to get some sense of where the conversation had gone since Smith. But you're right that we'd have to then treat them on their own in relationship to this liberal tradition, which they have an ambivalent relationship to. I tend to think, it's a very complex oeuvre, but I think that there are a lot more points of connection between, Assad's sense of this and Smith. The conversation there seems to be a lot more rich in its possibilities. I'm less sure what the conversation would look like between Smith and Masuzawa, but someone who knows the whole of the Smith oeuvre might see more points of connection there, but that would be more difficult for me to draw. But yeah, I think this methodological question, how you inhabit these spaces back and forth, rather than kind of schizophrenically, which I have to say that a lot of times that's what I feel like. The kind of discipline that it takes to be able to work down the path, go all the way down the path with the skeptics, and at the same time hold on to some of these romantic claims. I'm more interested, I think, finally, in some of the cosmopolitan claims this side of the tradition is making. There, I think, we've got fewer distortions there. A lot of the romantic universalism, I can't see that form of sympathy, as particularly productive. But the cosmopolitanism, I think, is quite productive. As far as, the skeptics, what I'm really interested in there, I think, is this process of being skeptical of the skeptics. Continually moving, historicizing them. Of seeing the burst of interest, the new atheists, as, grounded in tradition and culture, and seeing the familiarity of their moves, and that kind of cultural historical work on them. And that's, so that's kind of the way I approach that skeptical, critical side of the study of religion. To densely historicize it, to be constantly skeptical of their own skepticism, and yet also, I'm drawn to the critical edge. They ask important questions. Even if they're overdrawn in a figure like Bennett, even if the freethinkers are overbold, there's nonetheless they're asking these important questions. They're just never letting religion off the hook, and they're constantly reminding all of these other folks who are studying religion, you're always protecting it and letting it off the hook in some kind of way. And so they're just constantly challenging you. And so I find that's the play. Now, I think it's very hard, in practice, when one's working on the ground with sources and materials and figures. But I tend to I tend to get absolutely absorbed in that problematic, and moving back and forth between the demands of these two positions. And I'm never quite sure I pull it off, but it's that kind of absorption in it that fascinates me. And as in practical terms, in terms of what I'm working on historically in the archives. And I'll defer to the philosophers for working that out more abstractly in theory. But in terms of my own practical dispositions as a historian, that's what I'm constantly trying to do. And constantly picking figures actually who heighten attention for me. This figure I've been working on, who Ann says, I hope it's a likable book. But it's a figure who is a crazy visionary in all kinds of ways, becomes a Freudian case study, an American Freudian case study, and so the medical, clinical literature that grows up around her is fascinating in terms of this extreme skepticism of it. On the other hand, she develops these occultist, spiritualist interpretations of her own experience by being deeply scholarly herself. Spending time at the British Library, getting access to books that no other woman had gotten access to because they were seen as, such a male-defined genre, some of the sexological works she was trying to get access to. I pick that kind of figure who just presents it in just utterly dramatic form, and then I just, sink myself into it and see if I can come up with the right sense of play and tension. But thank you for your questions.
Leigh, thank you very much for getting this symposium.